Hello everyone. This recording provides some background on research approach. It's actually just provides you a very brief overview because you will need to actually go and read some of the more detailed or watch some of the more detailed recordings on the research paradigm, inductive, deductive and abductive research, and also qualitative and quantitative approaches. So bear in mind that you'll need to actually go and look at that material as well to provide a bit more detail. So first of all, I've got a question at the top here, which is, what is research and why do we do it? And underneath that, I said, what do you research in your daily life? Now, we actually research lots of things in our daily life. So, for example, you might research places to go on holiday. You tend to do a lot of research in terms of deciding on products and services. So, for example, at the moment, I quite like going out to cafes at lunchtime. And of course, I don't actually know which cafes are open, whether I need to book because of the pandemic. And so I'm doing research before I go to visit these cafes. So one of the things you will all do is a lot of research about all sorts of different things in your day-to-day life, and you'll do it by maybe searching on the internet. You'll do it by asking your friends. You might do it by visiting a place to check out the details. There's all sorts of ways that we research things. Now you can see there that if you look in the books, they will tell you in terms of research that we might do in a more academic context or in an industry context. It talks about it being systematic and organised. Okay, so it's going a bit beyond sort of thinking, oh, I fancy buying such and such, I'll just see what it says on the internet about this. And it also, the books will also talk about checking, testing and refining ideas, which are themselves provisional. So you can see it's a bit more of an organised process here. And so why do we do it? Well, we do research in academia and in organisations because we want to make more informed decisions. We might want to change things that we do. We might have problems that we want to try to solve. And generally we want to make things better in some form. So who undertakes research? Well, lots of different groups of people. Clearly academics do. You as students will. Government and governmental agencies will do a lot of research. Commercial organisations do as well, and some of them are actually set up specifically to undertake research. But most large organisations will have some kind of research and development element to their work. Consultants, managers will be doing research all the time. So lots of different people in a variety of different organisations undertake research. And so while you might be thinking, well, I'm doing my research because I have to do a dissertation, actually you will find it will put you in a good position for the rest of your working life in terms of understanding how you might do research in other contexts. So I've mentioned research problems. So I tend to think about research in terms of what is the underlying research problem, and that's often what triggers us to do research. So these problems might be things that need to be, as I said there, solved for society. So there are a range of global challenges at the moment related to inequalities. There might be problems that are based within an organisation. So there could be something to do with managing the workforce. There are problems that relate to the environment. So a lot of my research is related to understanding how we manage climate change and how we mitigate the impact of our activities on climate change, and also how we build resilience in relation to climate change. So these are sort of environmental problems. So when your research is led by a problem, it's quite purposeful and applied. And a lot of research in the fields that you're all interested in is likely to be quite purposeful and applied research. And we can frame these problems as research questions, as I've suggested there, and I've given a couple of examples. Why do teenage girls stop playing football? It's a well-known problem. Another one there, how can organisations use events as experiential marketing tools? And looking at what's happening at the moment in society, in your different areas that you're studying, we can see a range of different problems. So, for example, in the hospitality sector, we've had to work out how we can reopen restaurants and what facilities and provisions we need to put in place that might be new. On the sports side of things, we are looking to reopen sporting activities. Now, that's tended to focus on elite sport first of all, but I'm quite passionate about grassroots sport because I'm currently president of Bournemouth Athletics Club. So I'm interested in terms of how you actually might get young people engaged and back involved in sport on the ground. And as I'm talking now, which is middle of August, we are looking at hosting our first events at the athletics track and getting people back competing in athletics, which is quite exciting. But we've had to research how to do this, and we've had to seek guidance from governing bodies. And then on the bottom, you can see from an events point of view, we've been having performances without audiences as one way to actually enable events to go ahead. But obviously this isn't ideal, and that actually means there's a huge economic impact of that for the organisations. And similarly, on the right-hand side at the bottom there, you can see the impacts of on tourism. So this is St Mark's Square in Venice, which would normally be full of visitors, with actually a very small number of people visiting, which has significant economic consequences, but also all sorts of problems in terms of actually how you manage that visiting. And at the moment, things like governments actually imposing quarantine measures on people arriving from certain countries, which creates challenges there. So one of the things we do in research is some planning. And you can see here what looks like a very linear process. So you decide on a topic or research area. You would look at the literature and review that and understand what's already been talked about on that topic. And then you'd probably refine your topic. You would then identify some specific research questions. And from that, you would build a list of information needs. So what do I need to find out to actually address those questions? From that, you'd design your research process. You'd go and collect the data, analyse it and write the research report. Now that sounds really straightforward. The reality is the journey is nothing like as straightforward as that. And you can see from the squiggle that I've imposed on the right hand side there, people often make a big jump forward and then they go back again. They realise there's a problem. So they go around in various loops during this process. And it's like this for all of us, not just for students, but for experienced academics as well. Now, in terms of this research approach, which I haven't really talked about so far, so research approach, this is the top level decisions you're going to make about how you approach a research project. Broadly, very broadly, it's determined in part by your objectives and your study needs. So, the nature of what you need to actually explore and find out to a large extent will determine your research approach. But there's also things to consider like your philosophical perspective, so the way you see the nature of knowledge and the way you see the generation of knowledge. In other words, the sort of relationship between yourself as a researcher and the people or the things that you're researching. So when you make research approach decisions, you need to consider these four things, and there are separate presentations on all of these, although there isn't really something on primary and secondary data. There's something that focuses specifically on secondary data. So you need to consider your research paradigm. This is your philosophical decisions, which can be partly to do with you, but also can be partly to do with the nature of what you're looking at. And then there's whether your study is inductive, deductive or abductive. And this is really about the relationship your study has to theory. And then it's whether it's qualitative or quantitative, which are quite different perspectives in terms of how you approach your data collection. So whether you're actually trying to measure and count things, which would be a quantitative approach, or whether in a qualitative approach where you would be exploring and trying to understand things in more depth. So and then finally there is whether you are using primary data, so data that's collected specifically for the project, or secondary data. And for each of these you'll need to explain what decision was made and why it was appropriate for your study. So very briefly, because I've said I'm not covering primary and secondary research specifically as a separate area, because this is really relatively straightforward thing really. Primary research is data that's collected solely for the purpose of the research that you're doing at that particular time. And typically this might be in the kinds of areas that you're working in. If you're doing quantitative research, you might do a questionnaire to collect data from a lot of people, or you might do interviews with a much smaller number of people, and that would generate primary data. On the other hand, we have what's called secondary research. Secondary research is data that's already published. It's out there and it's available, and we can reanalyze it in some way. Now, broadly, this falls into two types. One is a literature review, which you will all do, regardless of whether you're collecting primary data or not. And literature review is technically secondary research. It's not secondary data analysis, it's secondary research. But there is another form, which is secondary data analysis, and this is where actually you find data sets which you can reanalyze for your project. I will talk about that a bit more in a separate recording. But you can capture this from all sorts of different sources. So organisations, research organisations, companies often have secondary data, and also there's other forms of secondary data like social media feeds that you might be able to use. So I'm going to finish here and suggest you now go and actually have a read at some of them, or rather listen to some of the more detailed sessions that fall under this section.